If you've offended somebody and it's their insecurities that they've triggered and it causes you pain in the end because of that, then you can't sit there and just go say things. Maybe I have to mold what I say a little bit. I have to say less than necessary. Law number 4. I tell people is you can do two things at once. Everything in life doesn't have to be black and white. So when you're in the social realm, everyone's an actor. Everyone's wearing a mask. You're playing a part. You can't be completely authentic. You think you're being authentic, but you're not. If you really analyzed it, you're kind of being a little bit spontaneous. I tell you, when I finished the first chapter, I was like, oh my God, how am I ever going to get through this? Then I finished the second chapter and go, oh God, how am I ever going to get through this? Then the third chapter, I go, all right, I can see it's working. The fourth chapter, wow, Robert, you actually, I don't like to say it this way, but I was kind of amazed. When I look back at all that I had to do, I could almost cry. It was so difficult, but I got through all 12 chapters plus the preface with that kind of process that I just mentioned to you. Well, there are several moments. So when I'm in the groove and I'm writing and it's going well and I'm enjoying it, that's very, very satisfying. Oh. Now, that's not most of the time. That's a small percentage of the time. But when those moments happen and it's like I thought through an idea and I'm being kind of creative with it, it's very, very satisfying. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because ideas come to you. You don't even know where. Yeah. And then when I finished the chapter, wow, and it kind of came together. Mm-hmm. Okay. And now, having finished the whole book, I can't even begin to describe what that feels. I'm still insecure about it. I still want people to give me positive feedback. I kind of need it. Yeah. Because it was for 7 years, it's all I did, right? I didn't do anything else. So I'm invested so deeply in it that if people have like niggly comments, I tend to take it personally. But I'll get over that. But the feeling that I climbed that mountain, and I've had to climb other mountains. Human nature was a big climb, but nothing like this. I'll be able to die knowing that I did that, and it's very satisfying. It's always played a huge role. When I was younger, and I meant like when I wrote the 48 Laws of Power, and my mind was quicker than it is today, things would come to me out of nowhere. Yeah, I don't know where I made that connection, right? And the best things happen that way. Mm-hmm. Now, I make the point in that chapter that just plain old intuition is kind of nonsense. A gut feeling. What matters is the level of preparation you've done, the hours you put in, and now your intuition is operating on a high level. It's rational. It's fusing, I think, intuition with the hours of preparation, the hours of work behind it. Then brilliant things will happen in your brain. All kinds of connections will happen. So mastery is kind of a lesson, even though I'm not a neuroscientist, about how the human brain actually works as opposed to our misconceptions about it. It was interesting because also another podcast that I loved was Andrew Huberman, who is a neuroscientist, and he credits mastery for changing his life or becoming a podcaster. There you go. Right. So he kind of confirmed some of the things I'm saying. But when you study something deeply, 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 you spend hours, you're reading about it, you're thinking about it, things are happening unconsciously in your brain. Connections are going on that you're not even aware of, right? And so you have to go deep into that process for this to happen. It's like the soil is being enriched with all of these things that you can't see, and then things will blossom. But if you don't go deep into that process, nothing will ever cohere, nothing will ever happen. So for me, all that preparation, all the research is feeding that soil, and then great ideas come to me without ever having to think. Yeah. And they're the best ideas by far. So that's how it kind of operates with me. I've always been very, very intuitive. My wife can attest to this. I can be very loose with my mind, and I tell stories, and I just like to completely be spontaneous and let my mind roam like that. And it's important in the creative process, anybody who's creative, to reach that point where you just let go and you let the mind go crazy. And the best ideas come to you when you let the mind go a little bit crazy. Well, you're confusing me there because the business world is the business world, and I my work isn't really. So I know, like in business where things are like millions of dollars are at stake, you can't be as free as I just spoke, right? It's a little little bit it can be a little bit dangerous. I don't know. So I don't know if I'm exactly answering your question, but let's say I'm in the process of writing my book and I'm coming up with chapters and I'm coming up with ideas. Some of the most fun is in the initial stages where I'm kind of being free and loose. Something has to click. Something has to excite me. There has to be drama. There has to be something weird going on that feels not stale, not predictable. And it excites me. And then I go with it. And that's pure intuition, right? So I know that if I try and do things with other books in mind or with making a lot of money, I go astray. So I have to be happy. I have to be excited. I have to feel something strange is going on. So chapter 2 in the Sublime book has a very strange title, but I love the title because of its strangeness. It's called Awaken to the Strangeness of Being Alive, right? And the idea is that being alive is the weirdest thing you can ever think about. That you are actually alive and conscious in a world with all this other shit around you is like the weirdest thing you could ever think about. You have to think about that. And when I had that intuitive chapter title, I go, wow, that's great. You have to go with that. You know, what are best practices? Who knows? I was on the board of directors for 6 years, at least, of American Apparel, publicly traded company. I have no business background. I didn't even know what EBITDA was. Okay. I'm there and it's all about best practices. It's all about what's gone on before. It's all about risk management, all these serious things. And yet the company went down the tubes and was a massive failure, right? These people aren't creative. A lot of people in business are incredibly uncreative. They're all about cookie cutter. They're all about the quarterly report and what's going to appeal to Wall Street. They have no vision. They're not loose. They don't think deeply. They create brands that become stale very quickly. Business, for all the we think that it's so rational, is actually full of emotions and irrationality. Yeah. And that was a real eye-opener to me to see that. So it made me see when people say best practices, like, oh, come on, think for yourself. Yeah. I was writing books before I started the meditation, so I can't credit it for that. It was mostly because I know the tenseness in my body and how my mind is too active, and my health was going to suffer for that. So I turned to this meditation. I'd always been wanting to meditate, but I never was able to sit down and actually get the discipline to do it every day until literally 15 years ago. So, so I turned to it for health reasons because I felt like I was going to have a heart attack or something. It was too intense. And, I mean, there are a lot, part of it is maybe my own snobbery or something that I didn't go for the more common, easier forms of meditation. Not that I don't respect them. Like Vipassana is a beautiful thing. And even mindfulness is a beautiful thing. And I know people who do very well with that. I was attracted to the hardest, kind of most archaic or arcane form of meditation, which is Zen in a way, because it's very non-directed. You're not told you're not given a formula, you're not given a mantra, you're not given even much direction, right? You're emptying your mind. And you could be meditating on a koan, which is like a little kind of paradoxical bit of wisdom that makes no sense that you have to meditate on and then will lead to some kind of enlightened moment. Or you're doing what's called shikantaza, which is a lot of what I do, which is basically 40 minutes of nothing, no thinking, nothing, blankness, emptiness, no thoughts. And then I do have a meditation where I do work on a koan. But lately, my mind has been so scattered that I try to do this thing where you literally try and not think about anything. So you're staring at the wall, right?
Your eyes are open?
Your eyes are open. They're not completely open. They're kind of like that. You're staring at a blank wall, okay? And that wall is what you're thinking of, right? And then as you're there, you realize that it's impossible to be blank. Things are always happening in that mind. And you try and stop it. You try and literally stop it. You try and make the whiteness what you're thinking of. And then these images come in, then these words come in, these anxieties come in. The moment they pop up, goodbye, adios, let go. So there's a great book on Zen meditation saying, let go of the hand of thought. So every time you have a thought, you're like holding on to it and you become obsessed, which is in Zen, that's the form of humans' mental disease, the illness, that we hold on to things that we can't let go of, our obsessions, right? Each time a thought comes in, it's like it's with your hand, let go. You have another thought, you let go. Then you reach a state called samadhi, which literally means in Sanskrit means absorption, where you're so absorbed in that white wall that everything disappears and it's blissful. And that certainly doesn't happen every time, but it's a wonderful feeling. And that's sort of what I go through every day. The other thing that happens is, so before my stroke, I did a lot of exercise and hiking and stuff. Now I just have this silly bike that I go up into the hills with. I meditate when I'm on my bike. And what I do is, I just have the sounds that are going on, and that becomes all that I think about. The silence, the birds chirping, the cars passing. It's another form of emptiness or blankness. So you should be practicing this in your day-to-day life when you're cooking or eating. I'm not good enough at that, but that's the goal that you want. There's a paradox even in Zen meditation. There are different schools of it. There's a school, I don't want to get esoteric here, but there's a school where you don't strive for anything. Just the practice of sitting. The idea is you are already enlightened. You don't need to strive for enlightenment. And there's a tougher, harder school of Zen meditation, the kind that turned into samurai warriors practicing Zen meditation. And the 18th century great Zen practitioner Hakuin, who was one of my idols, it was different. It's about discipline. It's about hardness. It's about years and years of straining and practicing and emptying the mind, and then enlightenment happens, right? And so you can't just suddenly start and be completely spontaneous. That kind of brilliance comes from years of practice, and then the spontaneity will mean something. I mean, there's a paradox there. I don't want to bore your listeners with that, but I know what you mean about the authenticity versus always having to wear a mask, strive for that. And the thing that I tell people is you can do two things at once. Everything in life doesn't have to be black and white. So when you're in the social realm, everyone's an actor. Everyone's wearing a mask. You're playing a part. You can't be completely authentic. You think you're being authentic, but you're not. If you really analyzed it, you're kind of being a little bit spontaneous, but you're also modeling it on you're not being the same with me as you are with other people, right? You're different with your father, your mother, other people. You're always you're playing a different role. You're never exactly the same person. No, you look skeptical. In your business, when you're in a business sense, are you always like that? You can be that with me because I'm open. Are you with that with all your clients and everybody? I just think people are more calculating than they think they are. There's always an unconscious thing going on where I have to be a little bit different here. I have to mold what I have to say. I have to act a little differently. Defense mechanisms, you know, because social life can be very dangerous and you can offend people. So I noticed I've had Dutch friends before who are very direct, and they've offended a lot of people because when they're outside of Dutch culture, like they're in New York or they're dealing with people who are not Dutch, they offend people with their directness and it causes them problems. If you've offended somebody and it's their insecurities that they've triggered and it causes you pain in the end because of that, then you can't sit there and just go, oh, why did they like that? You have to go, I have to be more careful next time. I have to not say things. Maybe I have to mold what I say a little bit. I have to say less than necessary. Law number 4. I don't think that they cancel each other out. I mean, let's take Steve Jobs, for instance, an interesting example. First of all, let's get one thing clear. People are complex. People are complicated. It's never like somebody is just driven, somebody's just an asshole, or somebody's just kind. We're all a mix of quality. I might seem kind in general, but I can be quite harsh and difficult too. So we're complicated creatures. But you take someone like Steve Jobs, who had very spiritual inclinations. He was very much interested in Eastern religions, right? He grew up in the drug culture in the Bay Area, right? He was doing drugs. He was interested in Zen. He practiced meditation. But he was really hard on people. In his first iteration with Apple, his own company that he starts, he was bullying people. He was pushing them around and they hated him. And he was unsuccessful and he had to leave because he burnt himself out. In the late 80s, he had to leave. He was essentially forced out, but it was pretty much he agreed to do it. And then he went into his next iteration, which was that next computer in the 90s. And it was a very interesting computer, but he was still pushing people too hard. He was still not functioning well. Then he was given a second chance with Apple, brought back in the late 90s, and he did some reckoning and he went, this isn't working for me. I have to change my style. Now, when he was at Apple for the second go, he was still pushing people pretty hard, but he had learned a lesson that there were limits to what he could do, right? He had to give people some credit. He had to see that they couldn't be pushed as hard as he pushed himself. I'm kind of generalizing here, but he had like a reckoning. He realized that there were limits to what he was doing, and he became kinder. He was never a kind person, but he was less harsh, less mean, less pushing people around, right? He learned a lesson. Kobe Bryant was somebody who was the Black Mamba. He was incredibly, could be very difficult to be with, but then he mellowed out later in his career. He became a true team player. He learned lessons. Often Elon Musk has has not learned that lesson. Maybe he will. But you learn as you get older and you see the limits of your aggression that maybe you have something else. And we often become a little less narcissistic as we get older, although that's not necessarily true, but that can be a process. I know I was more narcissistic and self-absorbed in my 20s because I was more insecure. People are complicated. No one is wonderfully kind, 100% a saint, and nobody is purely evil and harsh. That's like the Hollywood version of our lives.